Here at Reuters Breaking Views, we spend a lot of time thinking about and writing about private equity companies and their deals. The buyout industry has come a long way from its swashbuckling roots of the 1980s and now manages funds worth almost $6 trillion globally, according to Preqin. It also holds large sway over companies and extensive parts of the economy. More than 13 million Americans work for private equity-backed companies, according to the American Investment Council. Most of the time, we and others focus on the deals, who gets the better of the end of the transaction, and the people doing those deals. Blackstone, KKR, and their rivals have become giant global financial institutions in their own right, with corresponding clout. But an industry that has grown so large and diverse defies easy generalization, and people are paying increasing attention to what private equity ownership is doing to the fabric of business. And in recent years, a compelling and persistent critique has taken shape, which goes something like this. Private equity-owned companies take on more financial risk than others, they have shorter-term investment horizons, and while their model may reward investors in private equity funds, and those who manage the funds, though even that is up for debate, the benefits for employees are harder to discern. So this week on The Big View, we're going to look at the dark side of private equity. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources for fresh insights about the biggest global stories on business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Tharlarsson. Our guest this week is Megan Greenwell. Megan is an experienced journalist who most recently worked at Wired and before that was editor-in-chief of Deadspin, the sports blog. She's the author of a new book, Bad Company, Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. We'll talk to Megan in a minute, but first I'd like to introduce Jeff Goldfarb, who's Breaking News Global Corporate Finance Editor. Jeff, you've covered private equity from every conceivable angle over the years. Why do you think it's a good moment to look at this aspect of the business?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think, private equity has expanded so rapidly. And, you mentioned some of the figures that are salient in terms of, how many Americans are working in this field. Megan also points out in her book that the private equity portfolio companies account for $1.7 trillion of U.S. GDP, which is somewhere around 6%.
Yeah.
And they've moved into all facets of life. They've gone from industry to industry, from retail, media. They've moved into housing. Was one of the more recent ones, medical care. And so people have started to notice, this very small, secretive, lucrative industry that existed 40 years ago doesn't exist anymore. It's now a massive component. And so it's a massive component of the economy. And so it's more noticeable to more people and it's getting much more attention.
Yeah. And there is this sort of growing ambivalence, I guess I would say about private equity ownership. And I mean, there are many problems. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we write about all the time, which is that, these funds have got so big, they can't sell their investments easily, and the public markets are locked up and they can't raise enough cash to return to their investors. But this critique is much more sort of about what ownership is doing to those companies that they own and whether that is actually good for the employees or for the broader economy. And I mean, it sort of started on the left, that critique, but you could say it's sort of spread since then, right? It almost feels like a little bit part of this criticism of an economy that is overly financialized, where things are engineered to kind of produce a return for investors, but not necessarily for the benefit of the broader economy or the people who work there.
Yeah, that's really a lot of the focus of the book is on this idea that what's good for the company or what's good for the private equity firm is not necessarily good for the company or vice versa. So,
right.
There's ways for private equity firms to make money, even if it doesn't necessarily mean long-term success for the companies that they invest in. And, she does this through the lens of through four workers, and not just for like any four workers. They're people who actually fought back, who got very stuck into what was going on, people that were really engaged with the industries that they were in. And she, she looks at a woman that worked at Toys R Us, which was famously taken private and then went bankrupt. The big retail toy retailer. She looks at a journalist who went to Gannett, one of the biggest publishers, and then was, taken over by private equity. There's a gentleman who was a doctor at a rural hospital, and then he became an administrator, and that was a group that was taken over and sort of decimated. And then there's a woman who's a sort of a housing activist, who was sort of living the American dream and wound up in this apartment. And then the whole thing goes off the rails with private equity ownership.
So there's been a whole rush of books about private equity recently, some of them also quite critical. What made this one stand out for you? What made you think Megan would be a good person for us to talk to?
I think because, she was personally affected by it because her, the Deadspin was taken over, and as she talks about it, it sort of became this personal thing for her. It just made her curious about like, well, what is going on, and because she uses a good mix of personal story, like telling it through the lens of these four workers, but also looking at the financial piece of it. And so she's got this really good mix. It's not like, it's got some financial perspective, but it's not too pointy headed, but it's also got this really deeply reported, personal piece of it.
Yeah. Okay. Really interesting. Thanks, Jeff. Let's listen to your conversation.
Megan Greenwell, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Your book is coming out at quite a pivotal time for the private equity industry. It's up against one of the most stressful periods in its history because of the market turmoil. Buyout firms are scrambling to deploy record levels of capital while simultaneously struggling to offload thousands of aging portfolio companies. And in the meantime, they're undertaking a huge shift into lending and other forms of investment too. But let's start with the origins of your book, Bad Company. This is quite a personal story for you, isn't it?
Yeah, I didn't want to write the book as a personal story because it's just not the kind of writing I do, but it definitely grew out of my own experience with private equity, which was that I was the editor-in-chief of Deadspin, the small online sports magazine, and we got taken over by a private equity firm about a year and a half into my tenure as editor-in-chief there, and it just went badly immediately. And so I got driven out of my job within about 3 months. But the result was it made me super curious about how private equity deals play out in my own industry, but also in others. And so I just started reading sort of obsessively, not really intending to do anything with it, just kind of wanting to understand better what had happened. And the result several years later was a book.
Yeah, you expand on your own personal tale. It's just a little kernel in your introduction, but you by telling stories of four others whose livelihoods and lives were upended by private equity firms. There's Liz Marin, who worked at Toys R Us, Roger Goes, a doctor and then an administrator at the rural Life Point Health Hospitals, Natalia Contreras, a journalist at Gannett, and Loren DePina, who was a professional organizer, if I understand, who lived at the apartment complex Southern Towers. They all have their own unique stories, but what were some of the unifying themes that you found in them?
The biggest thing is these are all four firecrackers of people, right? And I felt really strongly going into this book that the only way I was going to make people care about this subject was to make readers kind of fall in love with characters and tell the story through their eyes. So these are all people whose lives were upended in some way by private equity. For three of them, it was their jobs, and for one of them, it was her housing situation. And in all of those cases, they sort of refused to accept it sitting down. They all decided to fight back in some way, which is part of why they were compelling characters to me, because one thing I didn't want to do was end the book with like, this is a broken system. Okay, bye. But on the other hand, I'm not an activist. I do not really have opinions on what the right way to deal with this broken system is. And so to me, the best way to make things forward-looking was to focus on them and what they're doing after their lives were affected by this phenomenon.
Yeah, and they're also representative in a way because one's in retail, one's in healthcare, one's in journalism, and one's in housing. And it speaks, I guess, to the breadth of where private equity has gone into in American life, right? I mean, I assume that was part of also, I mean, you picked characters who, like you said, who fought back, but you have this sort of representative sampling of sort of, and tell us a little bit more about what you discovered about how private equity has, flowed into American life.
Yeah, so there were 1,000 industries I could have chosen, but I chose these because I do think they're representative and because they sort of tell a chronological tale, right? So Natalia and Liz, the journalist and the retail worker respectively, worked in industries that 10 years ago were super hot for private equity. Actually, a little longer ago, maybe 15 years ago, were among the hottest industries for private equity. And what we've seen more recently is private equity, with rare exceptions, is almost exclusively out of the retail game. Obviously, Walgreens just got acquired by private equity, but that is the anomaly, not the rule. And journalism too, like you don't see Alden making big investments anymore. It's just not, I think they sort of see that they've picked those industries clean. And so then Roger and Loren, the characters representing the healthcare industry and housing, those are currently among the hottest industries for private equity investment. Everybody wants in on housing, in part because the supply of money from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is just such a great benefit for private equity firms. That is money that was intended for, regular Joe kind of home buyers, but there's nothing to keep private equity out. And then healthcare too, because of the Affordable Care Act, that increased the amount of guaranteed money that could come to whoever owned a hospital or a other kind of care facility. And so that made it super appealing to private equity. And both of these are, sort of classic recession-proof industries, right? You're always going to need to go to the doctor,
right,
and you're always going to need a place to live. Media and retail are sort of the opposite of that.
Right. So I guess, my takeaway, you tell these very compelling stories. I guess I just wonder, I know you said you're not an activist. Your book is obviously very journalistic. You're telling it through other people's eyes, but what's inherently wrong with private equity?
I think the way the private equity system is set up divorces the incentives of the parent firm from that of their own portfolio companies. And I think that's a really problematic system. And I don't say this from an anti-capitalist perspective. I think it's actually sort of a violation of what we think of as free market capitalism, because what we think of is, if I own a company, my goal is to make money by making money for that company. And the way leveraged buyouts work, because private equity firms take on so much debt to execute a leveraged buyout, but that debt is assigned not to the firm itself, but to the portfolio company they've just acquired, you end up with this situation where what is good for the firm is not necessarily what is good for the portfolio company. And so you see that in maneuvers like sale-leaseback agreements, where in real estate heavy industries, the private equity firm will sell off the real estate, pocket the profits. And now all of a sudden, the portfolio company is responsible for rent payments on the same land they used to own. And while simultaneously being buried under debt. And so where we end up is that the portfolio company is struggling, and often leveraged buyouts happen in industries that have pre-existing problems. But private equity guys kind of position themselves as the superheroes swooping in to save the day. But what they're actually doing is making it more and more difficult for that company to survive.
But does that, I mean, I guess the counter, I mean, obviously you're very focused on the private equity industry and these examples and not just these 4 examples, because you have lots of data that you cite as well. But don't all sorts of companies, public and private, lay off millions of workers, borrow lots of money to fund their businesses, sometimes go bankrupt? I mean, what's so different about private equity in that sense?
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, there are all sorts of problems with our economic system, none of which private equity initially created, right? So I do think it's worth being super specific about which problems are attributable to private equity and which ones are just, massive problems of our system. But to answer your question about what's different, I do think this divorcing of incentives is different, right? So one question people ask me is, what is the difference between venture capital and private equity? And I think it's a really interesting question because in both situations, you can end up with catastrophic business failures. We've all seen that on the VC side of things. However, if I'm a venture capitalist and I invest in a company, my goal is to make that company successful. I am out there looking for unicorns because that is the way I'm going to get the biggest return on my investment. In the case of private equity, there is this split of incentives where what is good for me as the investor is not necessarily what is good for the portfolio company. And so you see, there's a data point in the book that 10 times as many companies that are owned by private equity go into bankruptcy proceedings as companies under any other type of ownership. So it's not as if it's a completely unique problem, but the data really does show that it is a worse problem in this world.
If that's the case, though, I mean, I guess one of the things that I get private equity would probably argue is that if that were the case, how would their business model sustain? In other words, at some point, either the pension funds would stop giving them money if they kept putting their own members out of work, or, if they weren't delivering returns of some kind, that somehow the whole mechanism would break down. And they would also argue, I guess, that they have skin in the game, right? So they are optimized to make money. As you say, it may not always be in the way everyone likes it, but if it were constantly just crushing everything, presumably the model would break down. Or do you disagree with that?
Well, I think it's that the private equity system is very good at making money for private equity and for its general partners, and in most cases for its investors. The data out there is a little bit sketchy on whether it is actually better at making money for pension funds and other types of investors than other kinds of investments. But let's assume it is, right? It's very good at that. But I think what's interesting to me about the statistic that 20% of private equity owned companies enter bankruptcy proceedings compared to 2% of other kinds of companies is that it shows pretty clearly that it's being good at making money for the firm itself is not the same as being good at actually saving companies. There's this theory that they're the turnaround specialists, right? They're highly trained surgeons who can go in, fix everything that's wrong with the company and turn the company back to profitable. And that's just not what's happening. So I think the system doesn't break down because it's working out great for the people at the top. It's just not working out very well for the companies that private equity acquires, let alone the workers, the customers, and the communities that rely on those businesses.
Right. I mean, I had not heard that bankruptcy stat before, but it's interesting. One of the things you actually write in the book is that, and I'm quoting, you say, even the company going out of business entirely can be lucrative for its private equity owner. What do you mean by that?
Right. So, I mean, we live in a world of financialization, right? Firms do not make money primarily by selling goods or selling services. They make money through the tools of financial firms. So everything from investing wisely to executing the sale leaseback agreements to taking advantage of the tax breaks to selling a portfolio company from one fund to another and taking a portion of that deal as profit. And so in the case of Toys R Us, for example, which was a very famous, private equity catastrophe, the company went fully under and laid off 33,000 workers with no severance. While nobody knows for sure because private equity does not have to disclose a whole lot about what they're up to, it seems clear, and Dan Premack from Axios led a lot of this reporting, that both of the private equity firms in charge of that deal actually came out profitable. So they drove the company into the ground, or at least they did not stop the company from being driven into the ground. And while it is true that they certainly did not make as much money as they wanted to, their goal was to take the company public, nor did they lose money. So the idea that private equity firms have skin in the game, I think, is actually a little bit of a misunderstanding because there are so many ways for them to come out just fine without the company itself coming out just fine.
Right. No, and I think you hinted that you get at that point in the subtitle of your book, which is Private Equity and the Death of the American Dream. I wonder, how are you defining the American dream and how exactly did or is private equity killing it?
So the American dream means something different to each of the four characters in my book. And that was part of why I was attracted to their stories. So in the case of Liz Marin, she was supporting a family of 5 on a Toys R Us salary, which is like a pretty impressive thing to do. Her husband was going to pharmacy school so that he could make something better for their lives. But in the meantime, this required her to support everybody on this salary. She's also an Alaskan native who had moved to the mainland to support her husband going to pharmacy school. There was no pharmacy school in the state of Alaska at the time. And so to her, the American dream meant, I'm going to quite literally pull myself up by my bootstraps by working at this company where I'm not going to get a lot of money, but I'm going to get enough. I'm going to have stability. And they're going to guarantee me severance if I'm ever laid off. She did not realize that in the case of a bankruptcy, she would never be able to collect that severance. But that was, all of that went into her thinking because she is a researcher at heart, right? In the case of Loren, she had been in public housing. She had really been struggling to make it. And she and her husband both got higher paying jobs. And to them, living at Southern Towers was absolutely the American dream. Like, it was this beautiful, clean complex with a swimming pool out front. Her kids could walk to school. They, again, really felt like they had made it. And so I think that people's concept of stability, whatever it is, whether it's housing, whether it's career, whether it's making enough money to get yourself into a safer situation. In Roger's case, the doctor, his American dream was literally taking care of a rural population. That was all he wanted to do with his career, and that came under threat as well. So whatever your own definition of stability is, I argue that private equity is currently threatening it because it has just taken over so many institutions that we all rely on, not just hospitals and stores and apartment complexes and newspapers, but also nursing homes and daycares and autism therapy practices and dentists and public utilities in a lot of cases. That's a big growing industry. So you can kind of define the American dream however you feel like you want to define it. And you can pretty easily find ways in which private equity is threatening it.
Got it. Okay. So I think the industry to a certain extent is I mean, obviously is not going to agree 100% with the things in your book, but probably agrees with some of it in the sense that there are some initiatives underway to try and address some of these concerns. I don't know if you spoke to him for your book, but you quote Pete Stavros from KKR, one of the bigger private equity firms in the book, and he's been out championing the idea of giving equity to employees of all the firms that they buy and encouraging other firms to do the same, in the sense of sort of creating a shared ownership. And what do you think of that and some of the other things that are being done to try and address some of these issues?
Yeah, I did interview Stavros at some length at the KKR offices. He was, really the only private equity executive who was interested in talking to me. And it was a really interesting conversation. He's such a smart and thoughtful guy about this stuff. And yes, he basically has pioneered this program where whenever KKR buys a company, they give the employees some ownership stake. This generated headlines in New York a year and a half or so ago when KKR bought Simon & Schuster, the publisher, and all of a sudden all these entry-level publishing assistants had an ownership stake in Simon & Schuster. It is a really interesting concept, and Stavros can point to cases in which it's worked really well. And I think there are also a couple of problems with it. One is that if the company goes under, obviously your ownership stake is worthless, right? And we've seen from the data that more private equity owned companies go under than other types of companies. So that's just one hole in the model. And the other is, and this one is complicated. I don't know what the right answer is, but I said to Stavros, publishing is a famously underpaid industry, right? A lot of those entry-level assistants are making $30,000 a year living in New York City, and that's just not sustainable. Why don't you simply pay them more in addition to or instead of giving them ownership stakes? And he said, look, I cannot pay them more because it's not my money. It's the money of the teachers, the firefighters, et cetera, who rely on the pension funds for their investments. And I think that's such an interesting problem with the system. The labor journalist Hamilton Nolan has called this capitalism's washing machine, where it's sort of a zero-sum game, right? For the teachers and firefighters and nurses to get their maximum pension, KKR has to a little bit screw over the similarly situated workers at the private companies that his firm owns. And so it's, I think there's a real danger in thinking of it as this zero-sum game where only one group of lower and middle class workers can win out and the other one by definition has to lose. So I am super interested in Stavros's ownership works model, but I am very wary of thinking of it as a solution to some of the problems that private equity has brought to communities and to workers.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, look, I don't think it's a panacea, but I do like the idea of more, workers, more 9-to-5 employees, like having an ownership stake in the companies in which they work. I think it's better for everybody, but it's not going to solve all the problems. That's for sure. Did you come away with this thinking? I mean, I know you're not a policy person, but did you come away thinking of anything that you thought should be done to try and prevent some of the harms that you identify in the book?
I think there's some really interesting efforts toward regulation, and those range from, fairly surface level to very extreme, right? So Elizabeth Warren's Stop Wall Street Looting Act would essentially regulate the industry out of existence. That is just what it would do. That's never going to pass or is not going to pass without a dramatic change in the composition of Congress. So I don't think we have to really consider that a serious possibility at this moment. There has been some interesting movement on the state level in a couple of places to just bring some increased scrutiny of these deals. So recently, Massachusetts just passed a bill for increased scrutiny of private equity deals in healthcare, and Pennsylvania is considering a very similar one. What's interesting about those is they both grew out of major private equity fueled disasters, right? So Steward Healthcare in Massachusetts, and a chain of hospitals in Pennsylvania both totally collapsed. And that made lawmakers sit up and say, okay, wait a second. So what is also interesting to me is that I don't think that this is a problem that is going to be simply regulated out of existence. I don't think it should be, and I don't think it can be. And so a lot of the work that is most interesting to me is work to reinvent industries from the ground up, because in each of the industries I focus on, plus any other one you could name where private equity is involved, they didn't create the problems of those industries, right? Like you think about local media. I graduated into a job at a newspaper at just before the 2008 recession, at a time when every newspaper was giving all of its content for free online to anybody who wanted it, and then was very surprised that their print subscriber numbers were dropping, right? So that was before private equity entered the picture. There were some catastrophically bad business decisions in media. And so the last chapter of the media section of the book focuses on efforts to dream up what a new media industry would look like. And I'm really interested in the wave of startup local nonprofits, a lot of which are doing really well, have become financially sustainable, are out there winning Pulitzers, are bringing real, robust local news to communities that don't otherwise have it. And so as much as regulation is, I think, a part of the solution, whenever some sort of system gets to the point where it's harming communities, I also am really interested in this work to sort of dream up what can we do better and just start something.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot to think about. Well, I'll give you the last word on one other thing. Your book is coming out into a lot of competition. There's definitely a growing cottage industry of books about private equity, including Plunder and 2 and 20. And these are the plunderers. And I give you a chance to give a little pitch. Why is your the book the one to read?
Yeah, I think those books I've read them all. They all do a lot of really valuable work. I think what my book does that's different is I am a narrative journalist. Those books sort of give a macro view of how this system works and what the causes and effects are. My book is what I originally pitched was Evicted for the private equity industry. I wanted to reach people who sort of understand that private equity is a significant force in our economy, but don't really have any idea what that means, right? This is not a book for finance heads. This is a book for people who, think they should probably know something about this, but whose eyes start to glaze over a little bit when they read the primer. And so I think readers really will fall in love with my characters. And I think those characters will show readers something they didn't know about what's going on with this system and what the effects are. They are all like fascinating, complicated, imperfect people. And they're all just really compelling. And I think people will really love reading about them and learn something along the way.
The book is Bad Company. Thank you, Megan, for joining us on The Big View.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks to Jeff and Megan for that fascinating discussion. And as always, thanks to you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. And don't forget to check out our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. Meanwhile, if you're looking for more thought-provoking insights on global markets, be sure to check out Reuters Open Interest, or ROI for short. It's the new source for data-driven expert commentary on market and economic trends from Reuters. Find the ROI team's analysis on everything from swaps to soybeans on Reuters.com every day. And finally, if you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And you can check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance, including lots about the private equity industry, every day at breakingviews.com and Reuters.com.